Hey YouTube, welcome to my brand new channel. So this channel is about making resto mod gaming PCs, emulation, and I hope you enjoy watching this video. Because I am brand new, a like and subscribe would really help me out to bring you brand new content and new builds that can combine old and new together to make something exciting. So in this build, I'll be showing you how you can take maybe your old PC that you don't use anymore and how you can take that apart, upcycle it and put it into an old recorder again that you may not use, or maybe something that you might like to buy off eBay to bring you back to the 80s and 90s, the good old days. With this PC, it works over Bluetooth, so you can use a PS4 Xbox controller to play some of the games that you may like from Sega and Dreamcast. So why don't you sit back, relax, and I'll take you through the full build process. So the first job was to dismantle the PSU. It was going to be the biggest part within the old gaming PC. So I had to desolder the negative and positive wires on the IC connector so then I can put that into the old recorder. Now I highly recommend that you do not take PSUs apart. Even when they're unplugged, they are still charged with electricity and they can give you a pretty nasty shock if you touch any of the components within the power supply. Now it took me a little while to get this IC connector out of this case, just because it was a little bit tight to get that PCB board out of that hole. But once I got it through, I then put the old case onto the back of the recorder and I used a paint pen to then mark out where exactly I'm going to be placing the IC connector along with the screw holes to hold it in place. Make sure that when you drill the screw holes, you don't drill them too big, because then the IC connector will just drop out of the case, and you need to make sure that the threads hold the IC connector tightly and securely in place. Now when looking at the switch, I was originally going to use the switch that came with the power supply, but I didn't feel like it met with the theme of the case and I really wanted to keep with the retro theme. So what I decided to do was I went out and got a toggle switch and I put that in place on the bottom there, and it was much easier to fit in place because I had to just drill a round hole rather than trying to cut a square hole out of the case. This was then wired into the IC connector, and that's would then switch the PC on and off as and when you needed to use the PC. Now it was on to the fun part and grinding the old PSU case apart. I was going to use this case to put all the PCB components within for the PSU and reuse it within the old recorder. This took a little bit of effort to try and make sure that the line was straight and that I didn't warp the case, because the heat from the grinding can really mess things up if you don't get it right. And just take your time doing this. Don't rush through trying to grind anything too quickly. After I'd finished grinding, it was time to put the PSU inside the case, which you can see there, and also finally wiring in some of the components within the case. Some of the wires were too short, so I had to solder some extra length together, making sure that the wire was the right gauge, and using shrink wrap here to then isolate some of the connectors to make sure nothing could touch the case or electrocute anyone or anything nasty like that. So the next job was to remove the front panel. This was fairly easy to do with a couple of bolts located around the front of the case. And what I really wanted to do here was to hopefully have better ventilation coming in from the front to the back. And I was going to use the front as the intake and the back as the exhaust. But unfortunately, there weren't that many holes on the front. There was only one hole for the speaker, and I needed to figure out how can I get better airflow coming in through the front of the case. The other thing that I really wanted to do was to give the case a new fresh look. So I decided to use some black paint and give it a bit of a refresh, and I think the results came out really good with a new coat of paint on the front. Now with the painting done, I decided to extend the front of the case out, so then I can then 3D print some additional vents going around the front of the case to get some better airflow coming into the PC. The next thing I also did was I 3D printed some holders for these vacuum tubes. I felt like it was a shame to just throw them away, especially with the history that they've got, and also I'm a bit of a fan of Mazda. So I decided to reuse them, and I glued them into the holders for the vacuum tubes by measuring the bottom of the vacuum tube with a caliper, and that came out really good results. At the side of the holder, I also put additional hole in for an LED. So this LED actually has a resistor in it, so that it flickers and makes it look, gives it that old school look when the PC is turned on, and you can look through the side of the case to see the old flickering vacuum tube and making it look like it's working as if it was part of the old recorder. So once I put the front panel back on, I was actually going to mount the motherboard upside down. The reason for that was because there was actually vents on the bottom of the case, but it turned out that it was a little bit too unstable and I didn't really feel comfortable about doing that. I also put the hard drive on the bottom, and the motherboard was put on standoffs. The other thing I needed to do was 3D print some new vents, and this was vents that were going to go on the top of the CPU, on the front of the case to hold two 9mm fans, and the fans that I used were P9 Antec fans, and they came out really good. I then 3D printed another fan holder, and this was going to be the exhaust fan. Unfortunately, I couldn't fit the exhaust fan inside the case, and it had to be mounted on the outside, but I still think that it gives it a professional look. And all the wires that are on the I/O part of the motherboard are inside the case. The only thing coming out of the case is the HDMI cable, and also the power cord, which is actually detachable through that IC connector on the back. And I think that gives it a really clean look. No USB cables or anything else hanging out the back or the side of the case. I just wanted to have a very clean one cable coming out, and gives it a bit of a professional look. The other thing that I also did was I thought, let me put a grill on the exhaust fan, and that was really easy to print. And the vents were actually the same dimensions as the vents on the front of the case, just to pay homage to the old school recorder and fits into the theme. Now the next thing I needed to do was fit a GPU into the case. I originally going to use a R7 240, but it was a little too weak for what I wanted, so I ended up getting a GT 1030. The unfortunate thing is I had to take the shroud off to fit a Wi-Fi Bluetooth adapter into the other PCI slot, but in the end it managed to fit in there really well. The other thing I wanted to do was to have some USB sockets for additional controllers that could be connected, but most of the controllers will be connected through Bluetooth, eliminating some of the wires. And then finally I mounted the motherboard into the case. In the end I used a Antec CPU cooler instead of the 3D printed mount that I was originally going to use. And finally, I could have gone out and bought some reels, but I thought to finish the look and have black reels on the case would really finish it off nicely. So with the emulation, I decided to use RetroArch with LaunchBox, and this is actually the paid platform BigBox which goes on top, and I really think it's worth the extra money to pay for this feature. It gives it a really nice clean look. As soon as you boot up the PC, you can go into this interface and choose many of the titles from the old school era of GameCube, PS2, Super NES, and the emulator I used for PlayStation 2 was PCSX2, which again works really well with a lot of the old PlayStation titles. And you know, I managed to get some decent frame rates, nothing really that amazing, because I was using an A10 AMD processor and I was using a GT 1030. It's not the most powerful PC in the world, but again, the theme of this PC is not using the latest and greatest. It's upcycling some of your old equipment that you have laying around the house. So I thought I'll show you some games running on this PC. This is SSX3. It's not running at the greatest frame rate in the world. It's running around about 30 frames per second because mainly the CPU and the GPU are fairly weak, but all the other titles work really well. And another game that is highly underrated is Contra Hardcore on the Sega Genesis, and this game is absolutely amazing. So you can download so many titles off the internet. I'm not going to tell you where you can get them from, but there are literally thousands of games from the old library that you can download and play. So this is my first video on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for staying right to the end of the video. I'd really appreciate it if you can like and subscribe so I can bring you more content like this and doing more retro builds that you might appreciate and you can actually do yourself at home with very little cost to yourself. I'll see you in the next one.